This is Jenna Hollenstein. She is an author and a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and she's going to talk to us about food, this incredibly important part of our wellness journey. Our relationship with food can be complicated. Maybe it shouldn't be as complicated as it is. Jenna, when I found out you were going to be on the show, first thing I like to do with the guests is I go to their website, or I try to figure out how do they describe themselves. And you describe yourself as the non-diet dietitian. And the minute I read that, I said, okay, this is a person I want to talk to, because that's really interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, I just choose not to associate myself with dieting, which is the traditional model for dietitians, because dieting for the purposes of weight loss is not sustainable. Long-term, it actually causes weight gain, and it causes a lot of harm.
Yeah.
A lot of harm in the process.
Why do you, I feel like we live in a diet culture where every time you turn on the TV or you read a book or you see a segment on a show or you check somebody's social media, there's some new diet. There's the keto and there's this and there's the food delivery service and there's the, I don't know, there's a million of them. You can name a million of them off the top of your head. Why? Why do those exist?
Well, I think if you dig down deep enough, you find that we all just want to feel like okay about ourselves and our lives.
Yeah.
And you know, the programming that we've been fed since we were really young about dieting is that that's the secret. That's the way we find peace.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of money to be made in dieting.
Yeah, it is the diet industry.
In part because
right?
It doesn't work. If it worked, people would not have this repeat business model where they lose some weight, so it works, then they go off on their own, they regain the weight and then some, and then they come back to lose weight again. That feeds the dieting industry, and then people think they need diets in order to manage their problematic bodies.
Well, and you know what I think is a really insidious part of this cycle is that you go on a diet, and the diet is not sustainable, right? We know that kind of mentally going in. We lose some weight, then it falls apart because it is not sustainable, but then we don't blame the diet, we don't blame the unrealistic expectations, we blame ourselves.
Well,
I failed, there's something wrong with me.
That's right, and part of why it does fail is because our bodies are trying to protect us. So there are actual biological reasons why taking in less energy than your body needs to function does not work in the long term. I mean, food actually looks more appealing to us when we're deprived. It smells better. You're not imagining that,
right.
You know? And that drives us to eat so that our bodies can survive. They're protecting us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a different way to frame this whole activity.
Well, and a lot, I mean, to what I understand is that at the core of what you teach people is to not treat your body as the enemy, but to use it as the guide for how they should be fueling themselves.
Yeah, I talk about using your body as an instrument of your life as opposed to making it an object to be perfected, and to really look at it as something that has been communicating with you since you were born. It's sort of the original long-term relationship, you know?
Right.
I mean, it's the only one we get, as far as we know.
Yeah.
So as we start to listen to it, we sense that it's actually communicating with us all the time.
Yeah.
Like, that hurts, or I'm tired, I'm hungry, I want chips and salsa.
Yeah.
I mean, it's giving us all kinds of messages, but we've learned to ignore it and not trust it.
And to mistrust it, which I think is really an interesting part of it. You work with eating disorders, you work with disordered eating. What's the most common thing you hear? Somebody comes to your door and comes in for a session. What do you hear mostly?
A lot of people never seek out the support of someone like myself if they don't have a diagnosable eating disorder. But the majority of people, and likely a number of people who are watching, are struggling in this sort of what I call a gray area of chronic dieting, in which they've experienced this binge restrict cycle. So they restrict because they're told that losing weight is synonymous with health. It's also synonymous with undying happiness. And then biological and psychological mechanisms come into play, drive you to binge, because that's how we sustain ourselves, is through eating. Binging is actually a protective action. And then we gain weight back, and so we come back to the dieting. So it's this nonstop cycle that causes people to feel really confused, anxious, paranoid. They don't know who to trust, where to turn. They're done with dieting, but they don't know what else is out there.
The alternative for you is called intuitive eating. Can you kind of explain to people what intuitive eating means and how it's really a departure in how you think about food and how we think about diet? And I mean diet the noun, not diet the verb. It's interesting that we have co-opted, the diet industry has made diet a verb, right? You need to diet, go on this diet. But it's not what we're talking about. Talk to me a little bit about intuitive eating. What does it mean?
So intuitive eating, you might guess that it comes from inside. It comes from our intuition, something that we're born with. And it's essentially a model of eating that was created by two dietitians, Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, in the 90s. The fourth edition is about to come out, not too long. And in the scientific studies on intuitive eating, the three criteria are being driven to eat by primarily physical reasons, as opposed to emotional ones, having unconditional permission to eat. So all foods are on an equal moral plane. The carrot and the carrot cake are just different types of foods. One's not good, one's not bad. And the third is that they have means of coping with emotions that don't involve food.
I think that third part is going to be a huge pillar for people because, we get a lot of questions that say, I eat mindlessly. I eat when I'm bored. I eat emotionally. And I feel like if you're not addressing that, it's going to be hard to hear the intuition or to separate the emotional impulse from, I want that carrot cake, from the intuitive impulse of, I think I'd like some carrot cake.
Well, and that's the importance of dealing with the physiology or the biology first. I often talk to my clients about when we're addressing intuitive eating, it's overlapping circles of the biology and the psychology. And they're more overlapping than not.
Right.
But you can't really talk about in emotional eating until you deal with the physiologic things. A lot of us are not fed adequately. And so we all need to be fed regularly throughout the day. None of us gets around this, just like we can't get away with no sleep. We need to be fed a balance of protein, carb, and fat. And so we start by often dealing with those biological things. Start by eating breakfast, a snack, lunch, a snack, dinner, a snack, finding a balance of protein, carb, and fat in each of those. Then you start to notice what happens, what arises. Do you start to notice that when you eat at a more moderate degree of hunger, you're more mindful? A lot of us are mindless because we're starving.
Yeah.
And we think of that as either mindless or emotional. We're just humans.
We talk about that all the time, which is the notion of, you come in from a long day and you're exhausted and you skipped lunch because you were so busy, and then you get the kids' food on the table, but you ignore yourself and you get everybody to bed, and now it's 9 o'clock and you haven't eaten since noon. How could you possibly make a good choice?
Well, then it's a combination of things. It's not just primal hunger, as they say in intuitive eating. It's also like, I need some me time. And eating is often considered a pleasurable thing. And so why wouldn't we do that?
Right.
I mean, I think we should normalize emotional eating also and not demonize it, because food serves lots of purposes. Do you always have to be hungry when you want the carrot cake?
Right.
I'm basically
and for
never
you, the answer is
hungry.
no.
No.
Right.
I'm basically never hungry when I eat carrot cake. It's just because I want the carrot cake,
Right.
If I'm hungry, I actually probably want something more substantive and then the carrot cake.
Yeah.
But that comes after a long process of paying attention and practicing and being very patient with myself.
We've got some great questions from the community. You already addressed the ones about sort of mindless eating. Sugar gets a bad rap, or maybe sugar gets exactly the right rap, you tell me. But a lot of folks are asking, could it be true that sugar has a drug-like effect? What about sugar? No matter how much I try not to judge, says Angela, and make it allowed, I just seem to want it more. Cindy Deal says, I don't enjoy food as much when I'm assessing my portions and tracking my calories. Should I be writing down what I eat? A lot of people, I think, are really worried about that intake.
Well, one thing in terms of tracking, there is an app that I would recommend that does not ask the measuring questions that focus on good and bad food. And it's called Recovery Record. And it's free for people to download. And it actually asks them the important questions, like how hungry are you when you start to eat? How full are you when you stop? How satisfied are you by your choices? What emotions or physical sensations are going on? So I think of it as asking all the right questions.
That's really interesting. And it's, I think, a completely different way of thinking about it.
Totally different.
Different way of thinking about it. It's like you're tracking your eating, but you're tracking your emotional relationship.
You're tracking your relationship with food. And then your question about sugar. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s when fat was the enemy, public enemy number one. And everybody was afraid to eat eggs and beef, because of saturated fat. And, now sugar is the enemy.
It's the new fat.
Yeah, it's the new fat, exactly. And I'm not recommending a high sugar diet, but I think that we need to remember a couple of things. We come out of the womb liking sugar. That's what drives us to drink breast milk or formula and helps us survive. Sugar tastes good.
Yeah.
Our brains thrive on sugar. They need about 120 grams of glucose, which is sugar, every day. So when we deprive it, it can function, but not particularly well for a lot of us. The other thing is that when, some of these stories that position like a functional MRI of a brain on heroin next to a functional MRI of a brain on sugar, they're very misleading. Those studies don't give you an idea of what the brain lights up in response to in terms of other pleasurable activities. And also, those studies never measure the effects of what we're talking about, restriction, which is what drives that compulsion that a lot of people experience.
When you and I were talking earlier, you said something interesting. You said people will use the phrase that they are addicted to sugar, but they're really not. If you stuck a bowl of sugar and a spoon in front of them, they wouldn't eat it.
I mean, I think of the chemical addiction model, which is that there's a dependence and you'll do anything to get it, and the behavioral addiction model. And like I said about the 9 p.m. finally eating, for some me time, eating is generally something that we consider pleasurable, and we don't necessarily always have other ways of giving ourselves pleasure and relaxation and comfort, and so we default to food. Right? Yeah. So it's just important to take the whole picture into account and to remember that our bodies are following their natural impulses.
Yeah. Great question. I feel like this kind of overarching question comes from Angela Kruger. She said, I've struggled with disorder eating my entire life and I'm just overwhelmed by food. I think a lot of people feel this.
Yes.
The conversations about food at work, weight loss, the ideal body. Are there any tips to just make this all less overwhelming in today's environment?
Well, the first one is to be self-compassionate, because you're not alone in this, And it's very hard to opt out of diet culture because we are surrounded by it. And so a lot of people starting the intuitive eating path feel like they're salmon swimming upstream. So self-compassion is a really important part of arming yourself when you're doing this thing that is right for you, but everybody else has not quite figured it out yet. Another thing I recommend is to detox your social media accounts, because those are a really potent source of the images and the messages and the sound bites that promote diet culture. The before and after photos, the laments about our bodies, I just started the latest blah, blah.
Craze.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, there are so many body positive, health at every size, intuitive eating, movement for the right reasons, which I think you outlined at the beginning. That has an impact. It gets into our eyes and our ears and our minds, and it changes the way we think. It actually allows us to start opening up some space around these really claustrophobic thoughts and start to make new decisions.
I like that. Jenna, thank you so much for the conversation. So important. Thank you for being here. We like to finish with the high five. I know we should shake, but we're a high five kind of group. Got it. You guys, don't forget, Jenna's got a great book called Eat to Love, and you can check out more information about her on her Instagram at Jenna Hollenstein. I think it's just fantastic and really a fantastic conversation. Keep this one going in our community group. You can ask more questions and keep this conversation up. Like Jenna said, detoxing from the social media that's sending you the wrong message and surrounding yourself with people who accept you on your path and your journey right here and right now. That's what it's all about. We'll see you again tomorrow, guys. Brand new Total Body Workout. Have a great day. Bye-bye.